Do you like a blue steel to me?
This has got a mud flap.
There's some things an Englishman will do, and one of the things he won't do is blue steel. Ooh, 38. Mountain biking is excellent.
Chromag, the Canadian brand that's historically made bikes for people just too darn cool for their own good, or indeed rear suspension, are now taking their steel expertise to full suspension bikes. The Lowdown is very much in keeping with the brand's ethos. It offers a mix of no-nonsense clean lines and an uncomplicated design that might even persuade the most determined of hardcore hardtail riders that riding bikes and not having your fillings rattle loose don't have to be mutually exclusive prospects.
In many ways, the Chromag Lowdown is the most normal bike we have on test. It's horse link with steel and aluminum tubes, and it's a full 29er, which helps with all the small bump and big bump chatter you might encounter on trail.
Yeah, Chromag are making more inroads into these full suspension bikes in recent years, and this is sort of the start of the Lowdown lineage. They do have the darker out, which we reviewed differently, but this seems like a more sorted prospect.
Yeah, it has a robust frame layout, predictable suspension, and overall just seems like a well-considered bike to me.
Yeah, and the old adage of steel is real is definitely alive and well.
The Lowdown is the least expensive bike on test, but it can definitely keep up, perhaps even in ways you might not imagine. It climbs very well, especially considering the weight and stretched out geometry. That stack value will keep the front end tracking, and there are high rise bars to help even things out. Although this bike does have a 490mm reach, which is long for our testers who can all happily ride size larges, this bike didn't feel as outlandish as its reach figures would suggest.
When climbing, I really liked its characteristic over rougher terrain and found that you could put power down even when you're motoring over some chunky stuff.
Yeah, it offered a lot of grip, but it definitely, to my mind at least, felt a little bit lethargic compared to something like the sporty Ibis.
I mean, it's a heavy bike, plus it's a full 29er, which is nice over rougher terrain, but compared to the smaller rear wheel, takes a bit more to spin up.
The Chromag feels more Cadillac than kit car, but anyone looking to buy this style of bike is probably more interested in how it descends. A steel, 38-pound bike, the second heaviest on test, is never going to be a fleet-footed trail bike. So does it do enough while descending to make up for being a slightly portly proposition?
This Lowdown bike from Chromag, it doesn't have an idler. It's not made of carbon fiber that can form and bend and do whatever you need, but my God, does this thing track at speed through rough stuff. We were blown away by its comfort.
It's true. It's a super comfortable chassis with a very comfortable spec choice, though we found that in really hard corners and over certain terrain, it was almost too flexy.
Yeah, totally. It does have that steel front triangle, but it also does have some key components in the stays made of aluminium to give it a bit more stiffness. One other thing that was definitely worth noting is, although this bike again is kind of bucking the trend with a smaller shock, although still very adequate, the damping was really quite excellent.
That's true. And then one note to touch on with the descending was the geometry. The geo of the Darko is pretty extreme. We're testing a medium-large here compared to larges on a lot of the other bikes. It has a really long reach paired with a fairly short stack. So we found that in steeper, slower terrain, you had a tendency to be riding more on the fork than some of the other bikes and could lead to it feeling a bit awkward.
I think one thing you do need to give it credit for, though, is on the slightly higher speed, steep tech, it really did track very well. You know, this compared to something like the Pole was night and day in terms of its comfort and tracking.
Despite foregoing the complication, expense, or compromise of exotic materials and extra pulleys, this bike really impressed us. There is a trade-off, though, in that it doesn't have the reactive, alive feel that some will demand from a bike that can pump and push for speed. Even with that alloy rear end, the bike did generate some serious flex, whatever the culprit. And these two elements, in some ways, means that for more active riders, those who demand precision more than compliance, it might feel a little vague at times. But let's take a closer look at that frame.
One aspect we really liked about the Lowdown was the external cable routing. It runs fully zip-tied to the outside of the front triangle.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's got external cable routing, but it still does divert through the stay at the back. To kind of either
defeat the whole purpose.
Gives it, I would say, the worst of both worlds, the clutter and the complexity.
Yeah.
One thing I did like, though, was that it's got a long insertion depth, but it didn't really have the drop of the post itself to match that, which was a real shame.
Yeah, it came spec'd with a 175 reverb, which is a bit of a bummer. On the bright side, though, it has tons of room for a water bottle, plus it's got accessory mounts underneath.
The slender tubing and simplicity of the Chromag offer solutions to problems other, more complicated bikes on this test ran into. In fact, it almost mocks them with its space for an extra large water bottle and long seat post insertion depth. The comparatively short rear end and long reach could give it something of a rearward weight bias, but that's effectively tempered with a low stack height. It feels like there's a lot to love with this lowdown. So who's it for?
So who's this bike for? Well, it's definitely for the Whistler crowd and the loving intersection between shredders and people who love pot. Joking aside, it's, it's such a tonic, I think, for a lot of people towards the sort of incremental gains that sometimes seem quite superficial. The iterative design you see in the bike industry. This is like, no, we're just going to do the bike we want. It's going to be steel, it's going to have these traits, and it's not going to be for everyone, and that's absolutely fine. But for the people that will like it, they're probably going to love it.
Yeah, I dug it. I think some people who want like a really racy, sharp feeling bike will probably want to look elsewhere. But for a lot of people who are just looking for something reliable and simple, the lowdown is a pretty good option.
So a refreshing take, even if it uses what some might consider more traditional elements. What are its pros and cons?
Pros of the Chromag lowdown. First off, the winner of the inaugural Pink Bike Hill Bomb.
Ooh, 38, fast guy.
It's comfortable at speed. It tracks really well because of the like compliance and general muted feel, and it has good geometry. It's a little extreme, especially in the reach number, but it feels balanced.
Yeah, the geometry absolutely is balanced, but it's not without its compromise in certain situations, especially low speed maneuverability. Furthermore, for those that want a sharp feeling reactive bike, this quite possibly just isn't it. It's also relatively heavy.
It's comfortable with a no bullshit design, all with great tracking. It was the fastest on our very scientific Fire Road Bomb, a factor that definitely didn't have anything to do with it being the only 29er on test, and it also impressed us with its excellent suspension feel, showing that you don't always need the biggest, heaviest shock for good performance. Realistically, for those that want something that feels alive underneath them, this just won't be it. But if you don't mind some geometry outliers and some extra weight and want to ride all day in a great deal of comfort, the Chromag might just be the one.